Welcome back to the deep dive, the shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we are getting into a really dense and often contradictory world.
We are?
And we're talking about public order crimes. This isn't your typical true crime topic, no murder or theft. This is all about that uncomfortable intersection of individual liberty and collective morality.
That's exactly right. We're sort of navigating the legal landscape that tries to govern our personal choices. I mean, everything from what you do in your own home to what substances a person might consume.
Right.
And our sources today give us a very rich, and I have to say, sometimes alarming, look at how the law actually attempts to regulate sex and substance abuse. These are what you'd call the classic social crimes.
And our mission here for you is to move past the simple, the black and white moral judgments and really understand the functional reality of it all. We want to know, how does the law enforce what we feel? Where does that moral line actually get drawn? And I think most critically, what are the concrete, just staggering social and economic costs of the way we police these acts right now?
And we're really going to examine whether these crimes, which are so often labeled victimless, truly are.
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. Because when you start to factor in things like public safety, the entire justice system, and, well, a $500 billion economic drain, the impact is anything but victimless.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. If these aren't crimes against property or a person in that traditional sense, how do we even begin to define a public order crime, a POC?
At its absolute core, a public order crime is an act that interferes with the general operations of society.
Okay.
And with the ability of people, of the populace, to function efficiently. Think of it less like a bullet hitting a person, a direct impact, and more like sand being thrown into the complex machinery of a stable community.
So it's a disruption.
It's a disruption of the social equilibrium. That's the idea.
And the regulatory core behind this, I find this to be maybe the most fascinating part of this whole legal sphere.
Yeah.
These acts aren't banned because they're necessarily physically dangerous to one specific person in that moment.
Yeah.
But because they directly conflict with our established social norms, our customs, our values, the law is, in essence, codifying society's collective emotional response to behavior.
It creates this fascinating legal tension. I mean, for as long as humans have organized themselves into communities, this debate over morality and what behavior needs legal intervention has existed.
It's ancient.
It is. And the criminal law, in this context, it does more than just punish. It functions to articulate and, really, to validate a collective moral conviction.
So it's giving a voice to that conviction.
It's the legal expression of societal revulsion towards certain acts that are believed to undermine the community's moral fabric.
Okay, so if the law is giving voice to this collective revulsion, that brings up a really critical question of social harm. How does society draw the line between, say, an immoral act, a private sin, and one that's so damaging it has to become a crime, a public menace?
This is where politics and power really intersect with philosophy. Our sources draw a pretty clear line, and it's based on perceived consequence. Immoral acts that are generally understood to only harm the actor, well, they're more likely to be tolerated. Think about, certain forms of extreme private risk-taking, or maybe something like overeating in private. The law tends to step back from that.
But the moment, and I guess this is the key, the moment that behavior is believed to be extremely harmful to the public,
Exactly.
meaning it erodes public health or safety or social trust or actively degrades our shared environment,
Right.
then it's usually outlawed.
Precisely. And the critical analytical question for us is, who holds the power to define that perception?
Right. Who gets to decide?
The sources make it very clear that the distinction between a private sin and a public menace is often determined by the prevailing moral majority at that time, and they then use the legislative process to solidify their value system into law.
So it's how moral anxiety gets translated into criminal statutes.
That's a perfect way to put it.
That anxiety, that perceived threat, is really the fuel for what our sources call moral crusades, which is where we have to turn next. I mean, these are not quiet academic debates.
No, not at all.
They are organized campaigns to actively enforce a very specific interpretation of morality using the state's power.
And the impulse for these crusades is deeply historical. We can look way back to the original concept of the vigilante.
Okay.
These individuals were often members of early, very tight-knit communities who felt a strict standard of morality was absolutely necessary for survival.
When the system wasn't there to do it for them.
Right. When official legal mechanisms were weak or maybe non-existent, they took the law into their own hands, and they administered a very quick and sure justice based entirely on their own moral code.
They really saw themselves as, what, temporary custodians of a moral order that they felt was actively failing. But the nature of modern moral crusaders is, I mean, it's far more institutionalized, right? And it's so complex, it impacts the legal system on a massive scale.
Yes, absolutely. Modern crusaders, they operate with an almost absolute certainty that their way, their belief system, isn't just one valid opinion among many.
No, it's the opinion.
It's the only correct one. And this self-righteousness, according to the sources, makes them feel completely justified in using aggressive, sometimes even extreme, means to achieve their objectives.
Their main goal, then, is to draw what they insist is an unmistakable bright line between behavior that's acceptable and behavior that's unacceptable, not just for them, but for everyone in society.
And their central justification, the engine that drives all their efforts, is always the same.
That society is in danger.
Society is in danger because of accelerating immorality. They perceive an existential threat to the social fabric itself.
And we really have to examine some specific and difficult examples of this modern moral conflict. And we're going to rely only on what the source material impartially reports here.
That's very important.
So, for instance, take the intense conflict surrounding abortion. The source material notes that some abortion foes have resorted to violence and even murder.
And their stated claim, their justification, is that this behavior is necessary because of the peril society faces from what they view as a profound moral decay.
The depth of that conviction allows them to rationalize crossing existing legal boundaries.
It does. It's an extreme end of that rationalization process.
Yeah. And then on a different scale, the sources also cite the gay marriage crusade. The political objective here was very explicit.
Very. It was to prevent the legalization of marriage for same-sex couples and to push for federal or even constitutional amendments that would declare that marriage is only between one man and one woman.
And what's key there is the mechanism of the crusade, right?
Absolutely. They didn't just argue their position. They actively engaged in political lobbying, fundraising, major legislative initiatives.
They were trying to use the established power structures of the state.
Yes, to impose their specific moral definition of a family unit onto the entire population. They sought to wield the power of both criminal and civil law to enforce conformity to their singular moral viewpoint.
It's a powerful realization, then, that these crusades, whether they succeed or fail, fundamentally shape the public order crimes we're looking at today.
Because they target specific behaviors, often related to sex and substance use, that they deem morally destructive.
Which brings us directly to our first major category of offenses. Sexually related offenses. Our sources neatly divide these into three areas for us to analyze.
Paraphilias, prostitution, and obscenity and pornography.
Let's start with paraphilias. This one might feel the most medically and psychologically rooted. The sources define them as bizarre or abnormal sexual practices.
And more specifically, they involve recurrent urges or fantasies that are focused on non-human objects, humiliation, or the experience of receiving or giving pain.
That definition right away highlights the legal challenge.
He does.
Paraphilias are often classified as disorders, which means they are, by definition, involuntary recurrent urges.
But the law generally cannot police a thought alone. It has to wait for an overt action to occur before it can intervene.
And that is the thin line, isn't it, between a psychological challenge and an actual criminal act.
It's a razor's edge.
So here's where the legal classification gets really interesting. The key examples listed in our sources include pedophilia, frauderism,
Which is rubbing up against non-consenting people in public places.
right, then voyeurism, which is secretly watching unsuspecting people, exhibitionism, often called flashing,
And then the more obscure ones like asphyxiophilia, which is sexual arousal from being deprived of oxygen, and sadomasochism, which involves receiving or inflicting pain for sexual gratification.
What's fascinating to me, and legally so critical, is how the law treats these different actions based entirely on consent.
It's the dividing line.
Sadomasochism, if it's practiced between consenting adults, is generally tolerated, right? Provided it doesn't cross the line into, say, aggravated assault.
Right. But behaviors that involve non-consenting parties, frauderism, exhibitionism, voyeurism, those are very clear public order crimes because they violate the public sense of safety and propriety. There's no consent.
We have to focus specifically on pedophilia, though, given its profound severity. The source defines it as a psychiatric disorder, where an adult or a teen over the age of 16 is sexually attracted to prepubescent children.
It's a devastating disorder. And the sources state very clearly that despite just extensive research, the etiology, the actual root cause, it remains unknown.
We just don't know why.
We don't.
Yeah.
We know there's an overrepresentation among men, but the underlying mechanisms are still being sought by researchers.
And crucially, the sources reference the tragic associated scandals among churches.
Yes.
This highlights that the problem of this abuse, it transcends class, it transcends background, it even transcends institutions that are dedicated to spiritual guidance and morality.
And the ability of this disorder to manifest in positions of trust, that's what makes the societal harm so exponential.
It's not just the victim.
No, the abuse shatters not only the victim, but also the public's trust in the very institutions that are intended to protect them. It's a profound betrayal.
Okay, let's move to our second sexually related offense, prostitution. The origin of the word itself tells a story.
It does. It comes from the Latin prostituere, which means to cause, to stand in front of.
It speaks to the historical public visibility of the act.
It really does. Today, the definition is much more formal. It's granting non-marital sexual access established by mutual agreement for remuneration.
It's a commercial transaction of sex, basically, outside of established relationships.
That's it. And despite being criminalized across most of the U.S., the incidence remains significant. Data from the Uniform Crime Reporting, the UCR, which is the FBI's standardized program for crime statistics, reports about 80,000 arrests annually for prostitution offenses.
80,000. And the gender ratio in that UCR data is very revealing.
It is. Approximately 2 female arrests for every 1 male arrest.
So why is that ratio so important? What does it tell us?
Well, it really speaks to an enforcement bias. Historically, the law enforcement focus was almost primarily on the seller, the prostitute, rather than the buyer, the client.
Even though the crime requires both parties to happen.
Of course. This bias reflects an underlying moral judgment that often targets marginalized women, viewing them as moral failures rather than as, complex actors in a commercial enterprise.
To really grasp the scope of this industry, we need to understand its structure. It's not monolithic at all. It operates across a really wide spectrum of visibility and organization.
That's right. We can group the categories provided in the source into 3 main operational environments.
Okay.
First, you have the highly visible, highly vulnerable street-level workers. This would include streetwalkers and bar girls. They operate in public, they face the highest risk of violence, and they are, by far, the most frequent targets of arrest.
So that's one category. What's the second?
The second is the highly organized, often protected environments. Think brothel prostitutes, who operate under the supervision of a madam the manager, and often work in a fixed private location.
This would also include escort services, right?
Yes, which essentially act as call houses, providing a higher-end, more curated service to clients, usually off the street.
And then finally, the third category would be the specialized or traveling workers.
Correct. Call girls, who often maintain a private, repeat clientele. Circuit travelers, who move between different regions to avoid detection or find new markets.
And what about the more ambiguous operations? The sources mention skeezers.
Right. Skeezers is a term often used for those who exchange sex directly for drugs, especially crack cocaine. And then you have those working in what are essentially front operations, like certain massage parlors or photo studios.
And we should also mention, sadly, the existence of child prostitution, which is a whole different level of exploitation.
A completely different crime, yes.
That organizational complexity, especially for the street-level workers you mentioned, it ties directly back to the root causes.
It does. Our sources highlight a very powerful sociological link here. Both male and female street-level sex workers frequently originate from profoundly troubled homes and backgrounds.
What does that mean, troubled homes?
We're talking about homes often marked by extreme conflict, abuse, neglect, or hostility. This reality changes the narrative from one of simple moral choice
to one of survival and coping.
Exactly. For many, prostitution isn't a rational economic decision in the way we might think of other jobs. It's a mechanism to escape trauma, to fund a substance dependency, or in some cases, simply to survive extreme poverty.
And the history of controlling this, even at the federal level, it shows this persistent anxiety in the U.S. about moral purity.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
One of the earliest federal incursions was the Mann Act of 1925.
Right, the White Slave Traffic Act.
That's the one. It prohibited bringing women into the country or transporting them across state lines for the purpose of prostitution.
And domestically, how is it handled now?
Domestically, prosecution for the act itself is usually a misdemeanor. It typically results in a fine or maybe a short jail sentence.
But it's also gone global, hasn't it? The U.S. has targeted international travel.
It has. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 criminalizes traveling abroad, specifically for the purpose of engaging in sexual activity with minors.
So despite a century of legal attempts to suppress it, the debate to legalize or decriminalize prostitution is still fiercely active.
Very much so.
And what's fascinating is that you have two entirely different philosophical viewpoints that somehow converge on the exact same policy solution.
It's one of the great ironies of this debate. The first is what the sources call the sexual equality view.
Okay, what's that?
This perspective sees the prostitute fundamentally as a victim of male dominance, of patriarchy, of economic inequality.
So in their view, criminalization just makes it worse.
Exactly. They argue that continued criminalization only serves to further victimize and marginalize these vulnerable women, often pushing them deeper into the shadows and away from any safety or health services. Therefore, for them, decriminalization is necessary to protect the victim.
Okay, so that's one side. Then you have the free choice view, which is, it's philosophically the opposite of the first one.
Completely opposed. This position argues that if prostitution is freely chosen by an adult participant, it is an expression of women's equality and bodily autonomy. It's not subjugation.
So they see it as a legitimate form of commerce.
They do. And they argue that criminalization is an infringement on individual freedom and the right to choose one's work.
The irony is just striking. One position argues for decriminalization to protect the victim.
And the other argues for it to protect individual liberty. Our sources note that both of these viewpoints are highly influential and have shaped global policy discussions. It really demonstrates that the failure of our current laws is recognized all across the political spectrum.
Okay, let's pivot to our final category of sexual offense: obscenity and pornography.
This refers to material that's intended primarily to provide sexual titillation and excitement for paying customers. It's an industry driven purely by desire and profit.
And while the sale of adult material generates massive revenue, the legal and moral gravity just immediately shifts when we have to discuss child pornography.
It becomes a different conversation entirely. The statistics are just horrifying. The sources estimate that over 1 million children are believed to be used in pornography or prostitution each year, globally.
And technology has made this horrific crime even more complicated, specifically with the issue of virtual child pornography.
Right. This involves incredibly realistic digital images that, while they don't involve physical abuse in their actual creation, create just immense legal difficulty around classification, evidence, and jurisdiction. It's a legal minefield.
Another one of the enduring public debates in this area focuses on the violence connection. Does consuming pornography, particularly violent or aggressive material, actually cause real-world violence?
And the sources here offer very mixed evidence, which really shows the complexity of human psychology. There's no easy answer.
On one side, you have some studies that suggest explicit material has little to no connection to actual violence.
Or might even serve as a non-harmful outlet for sexual curiosity, a sort of safety valve.
But then, on the other hand, other studies strongly suggest that certain types of pornography, especially those that feature coercion or non-consensual acts, can prime or trigger aggressive sexual inclinations in certain susceptible individuals.
And that lack of scientific consensus makes it incredibly difficult for policymakers to legislate effectively.
This inherent complexity creates the tension we see in our legal constraints and protections. While all U.S. states and the federal government prohibit the sale and production of illegal material,
They constantly run up against the First Amendment. Court cases, like Pope v. Illinois, continually protect the right of free expression, even for controversial materials. It creates this constant push-pull with moral regulation.
So when it comes to controlling the market, the sources are pretty skeptical about how effective the law can be.
They are. There is very little evidence that pornography can be effectively controlled or eliminated by legal means alone.
Why?
Because the consistent, enormous public demand for sexually related material makes the profit motive simply irresistible. The market is too powerful.
So the control strategies have to shift. They shift from outright prohibition, which is ineffective,
To restriction. Things like zoning laws to control the location of adult stores, age verification online, and efforts to limit public visibility.
so they aim to restrict the market within socially acceptable boundaries rather than trying to outlaw the underlying human desire itself.
And that idea, attempting to outlaw a human desire, is the perfect transition point to our next massive area of public order crime: substance abuse.
Yes.
Just like prostitution and obscenity, the legal framework that governs drug use is less about physical harm to a random stranger and more about enforcing a moral standard on behavior the public finds repulsive or, socially destructive.
And the history of drug use is long. I mean, it predates criminalization by millennia. Drug use has been documented for thousands of years in various cultures, often for ritualistic purposes.
Even in the early United States, before the turn of the 20th century, opium and its derivatives were easily obtainable. They were often legally sold in patent medicines for everything from coughs to calming babies.
The pivot point, then, toward criminalization wasn't really a medical one.
Not at all. It was a moral and demographic crusade. The sources really highlight the importance of the temperance movement, which peaked right around the turn of the 20th century.
And this movement was driven by a very powerful moral anxiety.
A cultural anxiety, really. They believed that the purity and stability of the traditional agrarian American culture was being actively destroyed.
Destroyed by two things: the rapid growth of industrial cities and the presence of heavy drinkers.
And heavy drinkers was very often a code, a way to refer to recent immigrant populations who were residing in those cities.
So it was a clear case of a moral crusade using the mechanism of public order crime law to enforce a kind of cultural conformity.
And to punish groups that were deemed responsible for social decline. That underlying bias, whether it was aimed at alcohol then or later, at specific substances associated with other marginalized groups, has profoundly shaped U.S. drug policy ever since.
So let's look at the current trends in drug use today. Globally, the source material offers maybe a sliver of good news.
A small one. The worldwide drug epidemic may actually be abating, with some evidence suggesting that drug cultivation in certain key regions is in decline.
And domestically?
Domestically, we rely on large-scale data, like the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And that survey shows that overall drug usage has sort of stabilized over the past few years.
Okay.
There are slight declines in the use of most illegal substances, but one substance stands out.
Marijuana.
Marijuana use has risen significantly, which directly reflects the trend toward legalization and greater social acceptance in many states.
And of course, alcohol abuse remains pervasive. It requires its own kind of nuanced approach. For analytical purposes, the sources break users down into three critical categories.
Right. Current users, binge users, and heavy users.
Why is this specific breakdown so crucial for making policy?
Because if you only focus on the overall number of users, you mask the intensity of the problem. A current user might have one drink a month. Right.
A heavy user, who is defined by frequent and intense consumption, is the one who is driving a disproportionate amount of the societal costs through health crises, accidents, lost productivity.
So this categorization helps policymakers target their interventions to the most destructive behaviors.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the economic reality. This is where that academic definition of public order crime interfering with society's operations becomes just shockingly tangible.
The financial cost is staggering.
We have some detailed 2016 figures here that reveal a crisis measured in hundreds of billions of dollars.
And when you analyze these costs, it's vital to distinguish between the direct healthcare costs, so money spent on treatment, ER visits, things like that,
Right.
and the overall societal costs, which includes all the indirect expenses. Crime, incarceration, lost productivity, social services, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, let's break down the sources analysis. For tobacco, the healthcare cost was $130 billion, but the overall cost nearly doubled to $295 billion. Now look at alcohol. The healthcare cost was $25 billion, but the overall cost ballooned dramatically to $224 billion.
And then illicit drugs. The healthcare cost was the lowest of the three at just $11 billion.
But the overall societal cost was $193 billion.
That is the staggering insight right there. I mean, the total economic damage across these three is well over $500 billion. But for illicit drugs, the healthcare bill is tiny compared to the total bill.
Absolutely. That $11 billion for healthcare is dwarfed by the remaining $182 billion in non-health costs.
And that's all crime-related.
Almost entirely. That $182 billion is composed of lost productivity, justice system involvement, incarceration, and related crime expenses. This single metric proves that illicit drug use is fundamentally not a victimless crime. It is a profound economic disruptor and a massive drain on societal efficiency.
It's the perfect illustration of what a public order crime actually costs.
It is.
That analysis really shows why we have to understand the causes. If the problem is so vast and so expensive, what drives substance abuse in the first place?
And the sources highlight that there's no single answer. Instead, they offer 6 different perspectives that attempt to explain the causal factors.
6 different views.
And they help explain the complexity of addiction. First, you have the subcultural view.
Which emphasizes group norms.
Right. If drug use is normalized or even celebrated within your specific peer group or your neighborhood culture, individuals are just more likely to participate.
Okay, that's one. Then there's the psychological view.
This focuses on individual coping mechanisms. Substance abuse is often a form of self-medication. It's used to deal with anxiety, depression, or underlying personality traits that make emotional regulation difficult.
We also have to look at genetic factors.
We do. Research suggests certain individuals may be biologically or physiologically predisposed to dependency. It means addiction can run in families not just culturally, but physically.
And closely related but distinct is social learning theory.
This perspective argues that drug use is a learned behavior. If an individual grows up seeing family members or authority figures or trusted peers modeling drug use, they learn to perceive it as an acceptable response to stress or just a normal part of life.
What's next?
Next is the problem behavior syndrome, or PBS perspective.
Okay.
This one posits that drug abuse isn't a standalone issue. Instead, it's just one symptom or one manifestation within a whole cluster of interconnected antisocial behaviors.
Like truancy or minor delinquency?
Exactly. They all stem from a common underlying personal or environmental issue.
And finally, there's the rational choice model,
which suggests that individuals actually weigh the pros, the high, the social acceptance, the escape against the cons, the risk of arrest, the cost, the health impact. And they ultimately choose the behavior because they perceive that the benefits outweigh the risks.
The existence of these 6 distinct yet often overlapping explanations really shows why just throwing legal punishment at the problem hasn't worked.
You're fighting genetic, psychological, sociological, and economic factors all at the same time.
And these causal factors, they feed directly into one of the most contentious topics in this entire field, the gateway theory. Is there an inevitable sequence?
The pro-gateway view, which is supported by some addiction experts, suggests that abuse is often a gradual escalation. It starts slowly with alcohol and then marijuana.
The so-called gateway drugs.
Right. The theory argues that as the user habituates to these substances, they start to seek a more powerful, a different kind of high. And that leads to an intensification of usage toward more serious, illicit substances.
But the sources caution us here, noting that other views do not support this theory as, universal or inevitable.
No. Anti-gateway proponents argue that the correlation between early use and later serious use is often explained by those shared underlying causal factors we just discussed.
Like problem behavior syndrome or psychological distress.
Exactly. Not necessarily the pharmacological effect of the first drug they tried.
Regardless of the pathway, the complexity of drug use means the population involved in abuse and distribution is incredibly broad. It ranges from casual experimenters all the way up to high-level criminal enterprises.
Let's detail that full spectrum of individuals because this variety really demonstrates why our enforcement and our treatment strategies have to be so customized.
Good idea.
At the low end, you have adolescents who distribute small amounts, maybe just sharing or selling small quantities to friends to support their own use.
Then you have adolescents who frequently sell drugs, and critically, they start to move into other delinquent acts. The crime begins to fuel the drug habit, and the drug habit fuels the crime.
Right. It becomes a cycle. The next level includes individuals who are constantly cycling in and out of the justice system. They demonstrate this persistent engagement with both substance abuse and related criminality. This group often includes smugglers who move the product across borders.
You also have adult predatory drug users who are frequently arrested. They're often involved in street-level robbery or theft to fund their habit.
And conversely, there are adult predatory users who are rarely arrested. Perhaps because they have greater financial resources or they use more sophisticated means to avoid being detected.
And we can't forget the professional criminals. This includes the outwardly respectable adults who are top-level dealers, operating these sophisticated networks that generate immense profit and operate completely outside of that street-level violence.
And on the other side of that coin, you have the outwardly respectable adults who are frequent users but not dealers. The sheer diversity of people involved is just overwhelming.
It's clear. Drug use permeates every single socioeconomic level, and this wide penetration leads us directly to the undeniable link between drugs and crime.
The evidence of a strong drug-crime association comes from multiple consistent sources.
Okay, like what?
First, user surveys. These consistently show that people who report taking drugs have extensive involvement in criminal activity across the board, property crime, violent crime, you name it.
Second, we have federal data collection programs that strongly support this. For example, ADAM 2, the Arrestee Drug Abuse Monitoring Program.
That program collects data specifically from adult male arrestees in major cities.
Right, so it gives us crucial insight into the active criminal population.
It does, and it shows a strong, persistent pattern of drug use among those who are in the justice system.
And third,
correctional surveys. These confirm the connection on a massive scale. A vast number of inmates entering state and federal prisons report being lifelong substance abusers. It indicates that addiction and criminality are frequent long-term bedfellows.
but here is the critical analytical hurdle for us. What is the direction of causality? Are drugs the cause of crime, or is crime the cause of drugs?
And our sources are very careful to point out that the relationship is highly nuanced. It's often bidirectional.
It's not a simple A causes B equation.
Far from it. We see several complex pathways. First, crime can cause drug abuse. Individuals who are immersed in criminal lifestyles may use drugs as a way to cope with the trauma, the stress, or the moral injury that's associated with their activities.
Okay. And second, crime can support drug abuse. This is the economic driver we talked about. Individuals commit crimes, like theft or dealing, specifically to fund an expensive daily drug habit.
Third, and this is perhaps the most common, crime and drug abuse can simply co-occur. They stem from a common root cause.
So if someone has a predisposition toward antisocial behavior or is raised in an environment of poverty and disorganization.
Both drug use and crime might emerge simultaneously. They share a common genesis.
Fourth, our sources say gang activity can aggressively encourage drug abuse.
Oh, definitely. Substance use can be normalized, it can be required for initiation, or it can just be part of the group's social dynamic. It accelerates the use patterns of its members.
And finally, drug abuse itself can lead to other criminogenic activities and environments.
It's exactly. Being involved in the drug market, whether you're a buyer or a seller, it places you in dangerous, high-risk situations. It just increases the likelihood of becoming involved in violence or other criminal acts.
So the final conclusion drawn from the sources on this topic is essential for us to carry forward.
It is.
While conclusive evidence that taking drugs turns an otherwise law-abiding citizen into a criminal is lacking.
The data undeniably shows that people who commit crime use drugs significantly more than the average citizen. It is a powerful, dangerous co-occurrence that amplifies the total amount of public disorder.
Given this colossal social, public health, and economic damage, the federal government has responded with a century of legal action, all aimed at curtailing drug use, primarily through punitive means.
We don't need to list every single act sequentially. That would be overwhelming.
No.
Instead, let's look at this history thematically as a continuous escalation of control.
Okay, let's do that.
We begin with the early regulatory phase. This is exemplified by the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which was initially just about quality control and labeling.
And the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914.
Right, which began regulating the distribution and dispensing of opiates and cocaine, but primarily through taxation, not prohibition.
But this quickly shifted into what you might call the era of punishment and prohibition.
It did. This period includes the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the Boggs Act of 1951, and the Narcotic Control Act of 1956. This is where we see escalating penalties, moving from just taxation and regulation toward outright criminalization and much harsher sentencing for possession and sale.
Then the mid to late 20th century established the modern framework we have now.
That's anchored by the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, a landmark piece of legislation. It established the classification system, the schedules for controlled substances that we still use today, and it standardized how drugs are treated under federal law.
And finally, the era of mandatory minimums and the war on drugs, which really intensified punitive control.
It did. This period, marked by the 1984 Controlled Substances Act and the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 86 and 88, dramatically increased federal penalties. And critically, it introduced strict mandatory minimum sentences for certain drug offenses, cementing a heavy reliance on incarceration as the primary control mechanism.
So, after a century of this punitive approach, we still rely on a really comprehensive array of modern drug control strategies that span enforcement, treatment, and prevention.
And these strategies, they start globally with source control, which aims to limit drug production overseas in countries like Colombia or Afghanistan.
Then they transition to border control with interdiction strategies, which are aimed at stopping drugs from ever entering the country.
Domestically, you have the traditional law enforcement and punishment strategies, so incarceration and fines, aimed at disrupting distribution networks and penalizing users.
But the strategy is also aimed at prevention and rehabilitation.
It is. This includes community strategies, which organize local efforts to reduce drug use, education strategies aimed at preventing initiation, especially among young people.
And then the intervention methods.
Right, like drug testing, comprehensive drug treatment strategies, and employment programs aimed at reducing dependency and recidivism by providing a path back to a stable life.
The central conflict, however, remains.
It does.
The premise for the final major debate we have to discuss is that despite this massive, multifaceted, century-long effort incorporating all of those control strategies,
The fight against substance abuse has, according to the sources, not proved successful at eliminating the market or significantly reducing the societal harm.
and this failure is the foundational argument for the legalization movement. Proponents of this view argue that if the current, incredibly expensive punitive approach is failing to reduce use, crime, and that $193 billion burden, maybe a radical shift is required.
And the core proposal is this. If drugs were legalized, the government could then control the price, the quality, and the distribution,
And by doing so, you undermine the criminal illicit market.
which is currently the source of the violence and the disorder. That's the argument.
The ultimate goal isn't just revenue from taxes either. Proponents argue that if you eliminate the black market profit motive for traffickers and the need for users to commit other crimes like theft to fund their habits,
Then overall crime rates would fall significantly
it's an approach that takes the problem out of the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system.
and places it squarely under a public health model. It shifts the definition away from a public order crime and toward a regulated substance, just like alcohol or tobacco.
Which circles us right back to the core tension we started with. Our deep dive has covered society's attempt to legislate morality versus individual choice.
And the immense $500 billion social and economic cost that's generated by our current punitive approach to public order crimes involving sex and substance use.
We've seen that the law is often defined by the moral anxiety of the majority, but that moral enforcement can generate devastating consequences for the very public order it's intended to protect.
And we've explored the complex bidirectional nature of criminal causality, acknowledging that drug use and crime are deeply intertwined, but that causality is far more complicated than a simple cause and effect relationship.
So what does all of this mean for the future of these laws?
Remember the definition we started with. Public order crimes are acts that interfere with society's ability to function efficiently.
So here's the thought. If drugs were legalized and controlled by the government, and if, as proponents argue, this action caused crime rates to fall significantly, meaning society's operations were demonstrably less interfered with, would that fundamentally change the legal and moral classification of drug use?
If the punitive approach generates $182 billion in non-health crime-related costs, and a public health approach might generate lower societal disorder, the choice ceases to be a purely moral one.
It becomes a deeply practical economic one.
It does.
Would we then move drug use from being categorized primarily as a public order problem, defined by moral failure and criminal markets, to primarily a public health problem, defined by addiction, medical treatment, and state regulation? This is the fundamental provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we consider the next century of drug policy.
A philosophical shift from the jail cell to the clinic. The challenge is immense, but the data demands we at least consider the possibility.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world where personal choice meets public law.
We hope this has given you a deeper understanding of the forces shaping these controversial statutes.
We'll see you next time.